Okay, officially scary.
Officially scary. All right. Hey, thanks for joining us here today. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Laura Wagner, who is an associate professor at The Ohio State University and also the director of the Developmental Language and Cognition Lab. Is that correct?
Sure. Yep.
All right, excellent. And I want to begin just by thanking you for taking time out of your busy morning to chat with us here. And I'd like to begin with just a quick question. If you can tell us a little bit about your educational background and how you became interested in developmental psychology.
Okay, so my path to developmental psychology is actually a little nonlinear. My PhD is actually in linguistics, not in psychology. And I got into this field because I was interested in language. That's what I'm fundamentally interested in. And I actually went I did, when I was an undergrad, I went to Wellesley College, which is a little teeny college just outside of Boston. It's an all-women's school. And when I was there, I was doing adult psycholinguistic processing, so adult studies and online stuff and all of that kind of stuff. And I went to grad school thinking I would do that when I went to grad school. So I applied to programs that did language and mind and stuff like that. And I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania. And the person who was doing the most interesting work to me at the University of Pennsylvania that was psychology and language mixed together was Lila Gleitman. And she works with kids. She does language acquisition. That's where her questions all are. So suddenly I was reading all this stuff about language acquisition. I was reading about kids. I was reading about developmental stuff. And so I did my graduate work on language development and semantics, sort of combining those two. And as I went through, you know, the questions got a question I got kind of hung up on since I work on meaning. So I'm interested in how we connect meanings in our head to the language that we speak. I got kind of interested in this whole issue of where the meanings come from. Like, what do you start with? If you are, I'm on the nativist side, or the UG side, the whole Chomskyan side, feel free to ask me about it. But one of the commitments, if you're in that school, right, is that you got to believe that the stuff comes from somewhere. And so to really ask that question, you got to go to the beginning. So I did a postdoc, and I wanted to do my postdoc looking at infants to try to find out how are infants prepared to learn language? What do they got that lets them walk into this system? And so I did a postdoc with Susan Carey. And she was in a transient state then, so I did it at actually many different institutions. I did it at New York University, and then she moved to Harvard, and she took me with her. So I moved all around. I did postdoc and adjunct teaching. I'm a little cautionary tale for people who want to do things like move between disciplines, because if you have a PhD in one discipline and you want a job in another discipline, it takes a long time to convince people that works. So I was actually working with Susan and doing adjunct teaching for 7 years.
So wait, you went from linguistics to developmental psychology, right?
Yep.
And that slowed you down?
Yeah, basically. It took a long time to convince psychology departments that they could hire me. So I would go on job interviews, and they'd be like, "Really? Do you think you can teach this?" Or I'm like, "Yes, I can teach it." But it took 7 years to convince people that I could be in a psychology department, even though I had a PhD in linguistics. So I don't recommend changing fields to people. I mean, if you love it, you got to do it. It's what you got to do. But as a career move, it sucks.
Good advice. My next question. So this hangout is really about language. I want to move into semantics more specifically, but we should probably start with a general question. What is language?
Okay.
So what types of behaviors or what has to be there for something to be considered, using language or language? What is language? Yes.
Right. I mean, so the first thing that's worth mentioning, right, is that we use the word language in everyday speak to mean a lot of stuff, right? There's the language of dance and the language of flowers and the language of love. That's great. And mostly what people mean by that is communication, right? That things communicate information. And there are tons of ways to communicate information. And I don't count most of that as an actual language, right? I mean, in a everyday sense, sure. But in a technical sense, language is the stuff that we're doing right now. It's the structured, hierarchical communication system that is used by humans. And
so
it has all properties.
All language is communication, but communication isn't necessarily language. Do you agree with that?
Definitely all communication is not language. Not all language is actually used for communication. at least not for humans, right? So there's lots of people who believe, myself included, that it helps structure your thought. One of the byproducts of having a language is it helps actually organize your thinking, even if you're not using it to communicate. So if you ever talk to yourself, for instance, you know what that's like. And it structures memory, it structures, say, theory of mind. Being able to sort of impose your linguistic structures on something buys you a lot of cognition. So it's neither only it doesn't go either direction, really.
So you said communication is important. Then you started hitting the hierarchy and the syntax.
Right, so what makes human language special fundamentally is that it is structured, and it's structured at many levels. So it's structured at the sound system, it's structured in how you put things together, it's structured semantically, it's even structured pragmatically and socially. And the structures have properties. One of the big properties that language has is that it's hierarchically structured. So language is not just beads on a string. It's not just one damn word after another. It's words organized into groups, into clumps. And when we process language and we understand language, we understand it in terms of those groupings.
Okay. Are there any other? So we have the structure, we've got communication. Any other important features that are relevant?
The other major important feature for language is creativity. So one of the things that distinguishes human language from, as far as I know, pretty much every other system, although I'm sure someone's got a great example of Wales or something that will show me wrong, is that it's creative. So you can understand and produce things you've never heard or produced before. So probably a lot of the sentences I'm saying right now you may never have heard before, and if you want me to, I'm positive I can come up with a sentence you've never heard before. It's not that hard. And so one of the things that language has is people call it sometimes the infinite capacity. It's the idea that it's extremely open-ended. So most non-human communication systems are very, very closed and have a very limited repertoire. Human language is not closed in any respect. It's fabulously open.
Or to say, we know that there's evidence from primates that they can create symbols and, maybe sign language. My dog can associate. Sorry, example, but my dog, if when I say ball, it'll go get the ball. This wouldn't necessarily be an example of language because it doesn't fit in those three. It may, you may have some association between some word and object, right. But and I can kind of communicate with my dog what to go grab, but they probably don't have, the dog probably doesn't have the hierarchical structure of language, or maybe the generativity to be able to create something new.
Probably not, although, like I say, lots of people are interested in going after that. Again, one of the things, I'm a nativist, so if you're committed to this cause, and frankly, if you're a modern-day psychologist of any sort, language didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere. And so other non-human species have capacities that are in the right ballpark, right? We put it all together in our own special, unique way. But there are things that dogs can do. There are things that non-human primates can do. There's things that are about information processing. Birds can do things that are actually sort of shockingly in the right ballpark at times. Right, so there's all sorts of features about language that come from information processing or that we inherited evolutionarily. But no other species has put them all together the way that we have. Gotcha.
So now we have some idea of kind of what language is. Can you give us a sense of kind of either the different areas of language? So if I'm interested in language kind of more generally, but I don't know where to go, are there different kind of areas of language, questions that are being addressed right now?
Oh my God, there's enormous numbers of questions. So one of the things to keep in mind about language is it's massively complicated. And it's, so coming from the psychology dimension, we tend to think about it pretty much exactly as it lives in the human mind, right? That's what we're interested in. But there's plenty of people who are interested in language not in that sense. They're interested in it as an external object and just the way it exists and just understanding its patterns, like the way that physicists are interested in how light works, right? They don't necessarily care how the human eye processes it. They just care how light happens. And there's plenty of people who are interested in language in that way, and they're linguists. That's what they do. And language, like I say, it's very complicated and it's very layered. So you can be interested in the phonetics and the acoustics, how the sound structure works, how we process sounds, how we organize them into units, how we find meaning in those units. You can be interested in how we put those pieces together. You put sounds together into morphemes that have meaning. You put words and morphemes together into sentences for syntax. I'm interested in how all of this connects to concepts and how you put meaning on top of all of it. Other people are interested in how language works in social interaction, so pragmatics, and how you understand things that frankly aren't spoken but are implied by what you're saying. And there are people who are interested in what I've been interested in lately is something called sociolinguistics, which is the way we actually put huge amounts of personal information in the way we talk, whether we realize it or not. So each one of these are all these different layers that we have of language, and they all interact with each other because we do them all at the same time. And each one of them has structure, and each one of them is generative, and they all have their great properties independently, and then new properties as they interact with each other.
Gotcha. So now that we have a sense of maybe the different structures, the different categories, can you tell us a little bit about your program of research and how your research interests kind of map onto these different categories?
So what I'm fundamentally interested in is what's called the semantic level, or in everyday speech, meaning. So I'm interested in how we make language mean stuff. And there's lots of different aspects of making language mean stuff. So lots of people look at things like, how do kids learn the meanings of words like table and chair? This is not actually a trivial problem, right? So as Chris well knows, categorizing things into the right places requires a lot of cognition and memory and all sorts of good stuff. So that's one kind of meaning. I'm mostly interested in abstract meanings. So I'm much more interested in things like verb endings, and how do you get, the past tense ed, what does that mean? And how do kids use it? And what could they possibly think it means when they're 3 years old? Because kids use that morpheme a lot when they're 3 years old. And it's a little bit surprising to think that they understand what past tense means or progressive ongoing action means. Lately, I've been interested in another form of meaning, which is what's called indexical meaning, which is that I index myself as a human being in terms of the way that I talk. So independently of the actual words that I use, although sometimes those matter too, I'm conveying information to you about the fact that I'm female, about what my age is, about where I'm from. And I do that all through like the choice of the sound system, the vowels, and the way I put things together, and all of those sorts of things as well. But that's a different kind of meaning that you can actually get out of it. You get meaning about me. Again, fairly abstract, actually, as a kind of meaning to get out of language. In that case, the abstraction is in many ways much more about the form, but still, some of the meanings you get out of it, like where I'm from, is a pretty abstract thing to get. Mm-hmm. So I do meaning. That's my research program.
Gotcha. So what types of techniques, so if I'm interested in language and I'm interested in language development, what types of techniques can I do, like methodology? How do you test kids? Probably focusing on kids, maybe infants if you want to talk a little bit about, but starting off with just kind of general methodologies and how you test kids, but then maybe ending with, how do you recruit kids, which we'll get us into. I want to talk about your NSF grant. So first, methodology, how do we test?
All right, so methodology, meaning is hard. One of the things, depending on what age kids you're dealing with, it gets harder and harder. The younger you go, the harder it is, especially if you're interested in abstract meanings, right? If you want to know whether a kid understands ongoingness in action or can place you with respect to your regional dialect, this is actually quite complicated to get out of babies. Babies are basically animals, so your response measures are very limited. And even if you're dealing with older kids, it's
I'm glad I have this on tape. So babies are basically animals.
They really are, though, right? The work I did over my postdoc was going after abstract meanings in terms of, I was actually explicitly interested in, can we find out whether babies understand the difference between ongoingness and boundedness? This is a semantic distinction that's pervasive across languages, and so I wanted to know if infants could get it. But you can't just go up to a 10-month-old infant and say, so what do you think? If I use this morpheme, are you going to interpret it this way? And even trying to get them to categorize actions in a relevant way is hard with infants, because for something that's abstract, you need to give them many, many exemplars if you want to do it. And so what we ended up doing was basically asking what information they could track through a situation. Could they just track the boundedness? Could they just track the motion and action? It was okay. It was reasonably convincing that they can extract kinds of information. I don't know that I convinced anybody who wasn't already a hardcore linguist that I was getting the language categories out of any of it. At best, you could say, because they're infants, right? So we did habituation measures. So methodologically, we did things where we would show infants the same situation over and over and over again. And when they got bored, because they always get bored eventually, then you switch something up. right? And that's another feature that's true of methodology across the board, infants all the way to 5-year-olds. When you switch something up, you make the choice about what gets switched, right? So in my case, we would have something we're asking to track the endpoints of the goal points of a piece of information, of an event, and then we would either change the goal or we would change the location. And so we made that decision that those were the two things that were in contrast. And we showed that, yeah, basically, yes, by 12 months of age, infants are very happy to track goals. They don't like to track locations. They do this through a variety of different kinds of actions. They actually do care about boundedness, or at least I think they care about boundedness. But like I say, it's a choice on your part, right? It's a very, and because you don't get to change everything. If you change everything, you have an uncontrolled experiment. So you only get to change one thing. But then that means that if that's not the one thing that's the right contrast, then you didn't find anything out. So you have to do a series of control tasks, trying all the other different things that you could check out that it could have been that you hadn't thought of. Which is why babies are a pain, because you got to do, it takes a long time to get babies in, and then you can only change one thing per baby. You can test exactly one question. As you get to older kids, you can actually ask 2 or 3 questions usually, because you can give them more trials, and you can ask. You don't have to habituate. So when I work with 4- and 5-year-olds, we don't habituate them. We basically just give them a forced choice. And for when you get to like preschool age kids, I often give them an actual piece of language and say, here's a piece of language. Here are 2 choices, 2 videos, 2 pictures, 2 something. Which one does it go with? Again, though, it's the same problem you get with babies, right? I choose the 2 pictures. So you'd better choose 2 pictures, one which has what you think it means, one thing that has what you think it almost certainly doesn't mean, which is the right contrast. And this gets complicated, right? Because in some ways it's your assessment of the situation that you're putting on the kids. You get cleaner data this way because you get a forced choice task, very easy to analyze, very easy to know what their choices are like, but you've imposed that structure on the task. If you do open-ended things, I've tried this a little bit, we just let kids talk and things like this, then you get sort of what they're thinking about stuff, but they may not be anywhere near where you want them to be thinking. So when we try to get children, for instance, to tell narrative stories and get them to use the forms or overuse the forms or underuse the forms, that's great, but if a kid doesn't say something, you don't know why they didn't say it, right? Maybe because they don't understand it, and maybe because, not interested today in saying that form with your pictures. You don't know. So it's tough when you're dealing with the kids, especially with meaning, where you're trying to get what they think is going on with all of this.
So you made a point, infant recruitment, just running kid studies is really difficult, especially infants.
Yes.
I just want to quickly move to, how do you recruit kids? So how do you personally recruit kids in your studies? And moving into, how could somebody learn how to be, a research assistant? And what type of opportunities do you have to come, in your lab?
Got it. So, so if you're going to do infants, I'll be honest, the people who do infants, so there's people like on Ohio State's main campus, we have someone like Vladimir Slutsky, and he is an extremely good example of how you do infants, which is you have to run a factory, right? You got to have a lot of students, you got to have a lot of people, it's just a lot of phone calling. So when I worked as a postdoc, that's what we did. We spent a lot of time on the phone, calling parents, asking them to come in. It's time consuming and it's a pain. But that is how you get infants in. Honestly, at OSU, I have not been working with infants so much as I've been working with preschoolers, which are rather somewhat easier to get in. And currently the way I've been recruiting preschoolers is I actually run my lab at the COSI Museum. So if you're from Columbus or the greater Columbus area, you probably know this. If you're not, you don't. But we have a giant science museum in the middle of Columbus. It's actually... It's huge, actually. If you look at national rankings, it's well ranked. It's also enormous, and it has over 600,000 people who visit it every year. And right now we have, I've worked at it with sort of my little table in the corner. Currently I'm working at it in permanent space. And basically we go to the Science Museum and we tap people on the floor and say, hey, you want to do a science experiment? And we bring them on over to our space and then we run them. And this has the advantage that over 600,000 people come to us every year, and that's more people than even I can run, and that allows us to do things. The big disadvantage to working in a museum, at least in our setting, is we don't have the kinds of infrastructure that would let us run infants. Museums are noisy. And
control in general.
Yeah. So with a preschooler, you can set it up so it's reasonably quiet. You can blast the speakers. You can make them face the wall, and they do just fine. Infants, though, are notoriously picky. They're squirrely. And any little thing can set them off and make them cry. And I know one researcher in Vancouver who actually has a proper infancy lab in a museum, but he had to get soundproof rooms and the whole business, and it's a big deal. But we do, working with preschoolers, I mean, our lab, we worked with preschoolers and older kids and adults and everything like that, but we ran like 3,000 people last year in the lab. So it works out just fine for basically 3 to 4-year-olds and up, everything higher than that. So I'm basically, in my lab, we're collecting at the Science Museum. That's my solution to the recruitment problem.
So I want to help you collect some data. What do I do? How can I get involved in your
How can you get involved with my lab? Well, what an excellent question. All right, so getting involved in my lab, like getting involved with anybody else, you got to talk to the faculty member. Right, so one of the things that not all students are actually aware of is that none of us actually let undergraduate students just do whatever they want with our resources, right? We all work really hard to build our resources, whether we have an infancy lab, whether it's like the Mad Lab, whatever. We have our infrastructure, and if you want to do research with us, you come to us and you ask us, what are we doing research on? And if that sounds interesting to you, then you apply to work in our lab. So I do take students into my lab, and then if you're working with me, I actually teach a course. I'm not the only one, but I'm teaching it this semester and next semester, where we train people on how to work at the museum just in general, how to interact with the public, how to do outreach so that they know what the score is. And then they work with me and they move from that into collecting data at the museum. So, but the short answer is, you want to work in someone's lab, you think what they're doing is interesting, send them an email and tell them that and ask if you can work with them. And
also you have an opportunity coming up this summer, correct?
I do have an opportunity coming up. You're good. Way to fill me in. Right, so we actually have a new grant. So I'm going to be running a summer program this summer and actually next summer and the summer after that. It's 3 years. And this summer program is well funded. It's funded by the NSF. And so it pays about $5 grand for the summer. It's a 10-week program. And students who come into the program get training on everything that we do out at the museum. So it's a mini course on how to do outreach with the public and how to talk to the museum public, and then you get matched with a research mentor. The lab at COSI actually has more people than just me working at it. So I do language acquisition work, but we also have people who are doing online sentence processing with prosody and with sort of reaction times with adults. We have people doing speech perception. We have people doing social attitudes and dialect. We have a dozen different faculty members actually collecting data on different language topics. And so students who come to the program will get matched with somebody and they'll do something on language using the visitors from the museum as their research participants. If you're interested in that, we can post the web link, right?
Yes, that would be the best. So after this, what we'll do is, I'm assuming there's an application process, and there's a link dedicated to that. We'll post the link on the event page. So that
and the deadline is March 15th, so you've got plenty of time to apply if you're interested.
Okay, excellent. I want to talk more specifically about some of your recent research. So if you can give us a little insight into the recent projects, maybe talk a little bit of methodology, data, what you're finding, why it's interesting, that'd be great.
So, I mean, what I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years now is looking at meaning in this sociolinguistic way. So we've been looking at indexical meaning. And indexical meaning is really interesting because it's really complicated. So indexical meaning are things like things that index me as a person. And I focused on regional dialect primarily. So as you all probably know, you can tell where someone's from based on the way that they talk. So you may not know exactly where I'm from, but you know a lot of things where I'm not from, right? You know I'm not from England. You know I'm not from Alabama. Right, you know I'm not from those places because those places have distinctive regional dialects. So I'm interested first and foremost, when can kids tell that? Like when are they picking up on those differences? You might actually expect it to be something kids would be slow to pick up on, just because kids primarily early on focus on learning the meanings of the words and how to put them all together. And this stuff seems like a bell and a whistle, like it's an extra sort of thing to do. It turns out to be present in every speech that everybody says, but it doesn't seem like it's necessarily quite as important. That turns out not actually, strictly speaking, to be true, but that was my intuition at least. But the other piece about it is that we use that information for a lot of purposes. So if I did sound like I was from Alabama, you would not just think to yourself, wow, she sounds like she's from the South. You might think things like, she sounds so nice. You might think things like, wow, she doesn't sound too bright, because one of the stereotypes that we in the North tend to have about people who speak with a Southern accent is that they're not the brightest beings in the world. This, of course, is a stereotype, and it is wrong. I want to put that out there right now.
Questions are going to be coming in here in any minute now.
Right. No. Right. People from the South are not dumb, but it is a stereotype that people in the North have about people in the South. To be honest, people in the South actually know all about this stereotype. They have what's called linguistic insecurity. So often people in the South will try to do things like lose their accents when they move to the North, because they know that they don't always get taken as seriously by Northerners if they talk like with a Southern accent. On the other hand, if you have a British accent, keep that for all it's worth, because people will read you as a lot smarter. So you can be very dumb, and if you speak with a British accent, we think you're awesome, in America at least. So it's an interesting sort of social bit of meaning that you get out of all of this, above and beyond the regional thing.
So you've looked at this developmentally and within high-functioning autistic individuals, correct?
Yes.
And what are the main findings?
Okay, so so looking at kids, the thing that is shocking to me about kids is actually how bad kids are at this for so long. So some of the dimensions of meaning kids are really good at, like as infants. So other people have done the infancy studies that they can detect differences between different speakers of different regional dialects, even like British English versus American English. They can detect that. But if you ask like preschool age children, which is what I did, 5- and 6-year-old kids even, do you understand what this means? Like for us as adults, what it means is that you belong in a group with those people. You're from the same place as those people. You're part of, I mean, we can go and, we're not sure exactly what it would mean in terms of groups. Is it your family? Is it your community? Is it whatever? But you belong in a group with them. And it looks like 5- and 6-year-old kids don't get the group part as well as they do just being able to detect the difference. And that's, like I say, it's a little bit shocking that preschoolers can't do that. Recent work that we're doing now has been sort of mucking around with the methods and the specific dialects, and we can get 5-year-olds to pick out a group in a regional dialect. We can't get them to pick out as many as adults are, but if you give them sort of a much more open-ended task, you actually can get them to pick out a dialect that is least familiar to them, possibly containing more acoustic signals that, although that's debatable, that they can use. It can be done, but it is much, much harder to get them to put this out in a group. Now, we chose people with autism as a domain to look at this because the great thing about dialect is that it's at the intersection of exactly the thing that people with autism are supposed to be bad at. So people with autism are supposed to be just fine at low-level perceptual stuff in general, but they are not good at social categories, right? So famously, people with autism are not good at theory of mind. They're not good at social interactions. So we were asking, okay, so if you have autism, which part of this can you do? I mean, we predicted that if that pattern with autism was correct, and we're right about what you're doing with dialect, you should be able to do some kinds of get some kinds of facts out of regional dialect information, and some things you shouldn't get. And that's exactly what we found, right? Which is that people with high-functioning autism can do what we called objective facts. So we asked them things like, does this person sound like they're from well, in our case, Ohio, around here, because they were all in Columbus, Ohio. So do they sound like they're from Ohio? And the answer is, they know who sounds like they're from Columbus, Ohio. They know that Southerners don't sound like they're from Ohio. They know people from New England don't sound like they're from Ohio. They think Cleveland people might sound like they're from Ohio, but then again, so do all the Columbus, Ohio State students. Those people all sort of sound the same to them. So they can do that. But then if you ask them, okay, social attitudes. Who sounds friendly? Who sounds smart? Who sounds reliable? If you ask typically developing Ohio State students, they will tell you sort of, give you what are sort of well-established patterns about that people who speak standard dialects tend to have higher status, people who speak local tend to be higher on things like solidarity measures, like friendliness, and then there's all these stereotypes. People from the South score high on solidarity measures. They're more friendly, they're more reliable. People from the South tend to score more low on status measures, intelligence and successfulness. So those are stereotypes we have and things like that. And Ohio State students did what they're supposed to do. We appreciated that. Kids with autism, these adults, they were in their early 20s, 18 to 24-ish. That's the part they're not good at. right? So they don't seem to know about, I mean, maybe this is a good thing about having autism, but they don't seem to know about the stereotypes that we have about people with Southern accents. This doesn't influence sort of their social judgments. So we actually got the dissociation we were looking for, which is objective information from the signal. What is this telling us about where this person is from? They can do. Subjective, attitude-y stuff, not so much. So now, like I say, looking at kids, it's an interesting question, right? Kids are okay at social stuff, but maybe the attitude stuff, you need more experience with different kinds of people or stereotype. We're waiting to find out. We're actually we have a grant, and we're doing this in the museum of a huge cross-sectional study where we're actually testing kids ranging in age from 4 to 94 to find out the complete trajectory. Right now, it looks like 9 to 10 is where lots of shifts are happening, which is a lot older than I would have expected it to be. But you get a lot better at all of this around the age of 9 to 10. So
we are starting to run out of time. Do you have anything else about your research that you'd like to talk about, or?
Oh, good God. I mean, I have a million things. No, I'm good. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but yeah, I'm good.
Any questions in here? Yeah.
How many students are able to select for this?
Quick question. How many students are you taking for your program, your summer program?
Summer program, we have funding to take 10 students. We may have funding to take a few additional students depending on who applies, but 10 for sure in the summer.
Multiple year, though, correct? So 10 students.
That's every year. And it'll be different students every year because you can't do it twice. And if you're a student who is currently at a branch campus, you can also talk to me as a human being who's a main campus faculty member. I also just take students during the year, but I don't pay you until the summer.
Gotcha. So I guess last question. There are potentially people watching this that may be thinking about going into psychology, majoring in psychology, maybe thinking about going to grad school in psychology. Do you have any advice other than don't switch disciplines? Any advice for students that are maybe at the high school level or the undergraduate level, and how they can be more competitive for grad school, for applying for jobs after grad school?
Well, the first thing I'll say is if you're wanting to go into psychology or linguistics or any of these sorts of fields that don't obviously have dollar signs attached to them, you should do it anyway. If it's something that you really love doing, you should not let the fact that it doesn't have dollar signs attached to it, you should not let that deter you. If you want to major in it, if you want to go to graduate school in it, we all do this because we love it and it's interesting, and there is money that comes to you when you do this, right? So graduate schools, for instance, pay you to attend graduate school. So don't let I know a lot of students let the financial stuff turn them off. And their tuition, absolutely, right? So graduate school and a PhD program should be free for you. They should be paying you. So that's a good thing to do. In terms of being competitive, your best move for being competitive, I think there's probably two things. One is people are looking for commitment, right? We want to know that you actually like the stuff. So if you've been in an environment where you haven't had the opportunities, and your high school didn't have AP Psych or whatever, or you haven't had an opportunity to do something, that's not a deal breaker. So long as you can demonstrate that you actually care about it. I've been reading all about this. I've been taking as many classes that are related to it as I can. I'm trying. That commitment matters. And then the other thing is, if there is an opportunity, if there are faculty members around who do relevant work, go and talk to them and see if they have things that you can do with them. Being able to say that you did an independent piece of work with a faculty member of any sort, assuming that you do it well and they say nice things about you, is a huge advantage. It's the kind of thing that we look for people applying to grad school. It's the kind of thing I even look for when people are applying to like my summer program or in the lab. I'm looking for people who show commitment, and if they've had opportunities, that they've taken advantage of them.
Excellent. Yeah, I think the one thing I got lucky in that I passively kind of fell into a developmental lab. I just happened, my advisor was a developmental researcher, and that's kind of how I got interested into it. But there's also the being active and actively finding someone who's doing research and asking, I'd love to be in your lab. I'd like to help you collect data. This has a significant effect in terms of getting letters of recommendation, being more competitive, showing some consistency in your CV that you're kind of working towards a specific project.
And students don't realize we're just people, right? The worst thing that's ever going to happen to you if you write a faculty member and say, I'm interested in your research, do you have any positions in your lab? The worst thing is that they won't answer your email. The second worst thing is they'll say no. But I mean, but like that's it. That's like the worst that can happen. So you should always feel like it's I mean, you should always just try it because you could get lucky.
All right. Thank you very much for taking time out. What I'm going to do is kind of sign off here. If you can stick around and talk to my class for a little bit, that'd be great. So thank you for watching.
Thank you, Chris. This is fun.
One more question.
What are some important discoveries and theories that have been found in linguistics? Because trying to disprove stereotypes doesn't really seem that significant.
What are some of the important theories that have been proved within linguistics?
Proved within there's actually a lot of facts that have been solidly proved within linguistics. So everyone talks about the controversies, right? Ooh, is it really innate? Is it not innate? And that's still, some of that stuff's up for grabs, but a lot of it's actually not. So how language is, sort of fundamentals of how language is processed, the fact that language has structure, the fact that it's hierarchical, the basic organization of the phonetic system and the phonemic system, basic principles of syntactic organization. Linguists actually know the answer. I mean, if you're wondering how does language work, linguists actually have a lot of the answers. Most of the fights are about the details. They're not about the fundamentals. We actually like the idea that it's species specific, all that, and what it takes to make a language. All of that basically proven beyond doubt at this point.
I missed the stereotype component. Did we talk about it, or was there a second part?
Well, I was just saying, like, trying to disprove stereotypes doesn't seem that significant.
Trying to disprove stereotypes doesn't seem significant. So, like, what type of stereotypes?
So, like, the Southerners not being so bright.
So that would be something where I would say linguists, honestly, linguists do not believe that Southerners are not bright. Believe me, they don't believe this. What they have shown consistently is that people in the North rate people with Southern accents in a particular way. That's what they've shown. And so the idea that what seems to be uncontroversial is that we use the way people talk to make judgments about them. So for instance, right now, you all know that I'm a woman. Even if you were blind, if I were on the telephone, you can tell I'm female. And honestly, how you feel about women is something you'll project onto me. So if you have really awesome attitudes about women, then great, I'll benefit from those. If you have really negative attitudes about women, I will go down in flames on those. What we know is that you can get real information out of the way that I talk. What you do with that is a much more big social question. What we know is that people, and what we know as linguists is that you get the information, and we know people do stuff with it, but that's, like I say, what you do with it is more up for grabs.
All right, so I'm going to sign off. Thanks again. Thanks for watching.
All right.